All right, my friends, it's lovely to see you, or at least to see your names and your chats. Um, as we always like to do, we like to open with a prayer, and today we don't have anybody in the lesser saint category, but tomorrow is the feast day of Bernard Mazecki, and I want to mention him. He was an African Christian missionary and martyr. And he died in 1896. So he's a few years ago. He was born in Mozambique. He moved to Cape Town, attended an Anglican school, and was converted to Christianity through the work of the Cowley Fathers, who are our friends at the Society of St. John the Evangelist. So they remember Bernard Mazecki, and he was martyred on June 18, 1896. So we are remembering him today. Let us pray. Almighty and everlasting God, who kindled the flame of your love in the heart of your holy martyr, Bernard Mazecki, grant to us, your humble servants, a like faith and a power of love, that we who rejoice in his triumph may profit by his example. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
So, my friends, tonight we are joined by the Reverend Dr. Scott Stoner, who I figure has been my friend since maybe 1984.
That sounds right.
When were you ordained?
I was ordained in 81.
Okay.
So that would be about right. Yeah, that's about when we came to Milwaukee.
So David and I were married in 81, and he's from the Diocese of Milwaukee, as you are. And so he was ordained to the diaconate in 84. So we might have met a little bit before that. And so for a long time, you and David were the young guys in the diocese.
God. We were so young. Yes.
You were so young, and everybody else was so old.
But we thought we knew everything. I mean,
of course. Of course.
But yes, I was 20. I was 26 when I was ordained, which is pretty young. They almost didn't ordain me because I think I told them some version of that. I thought I knew everything, but somehow I got through. So
you mentioned that, did you, in your interviews? That's excellent.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
What I want to do is give you a chance to talk about your sure. Callings. You have twin callings, really, that have become one thing. So tell us, a little bit about your background and.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Again, it's so good to be here. And it is, and let me say from my side, my long and dear friend Kathy and David, it's wonderful to connect in this way. So I'm sorry that we have to connect in this way in a pandemic, but frankly, we wouldn't be doing this together if it wasn't for this. So I'm so
sure.
grateful for this. So part of why, I did discern my call young. And the way it really came to me was, I grew up in the Episcopal Church and I was active in the church, but you wouldn't necessarily thought that I was that active or was necessarily going to be the person to go into ministry at especially a young age. But my mother was a nurse in a hospital in the Milwaukee area, in the Milwaukee County hospital system. And through her work, she knew a bunch of chaplains. And so when I was I was a freshman in college, and I must have been mentioned that I may be thinking of something like ministry or something, working with people, or maybe being a counselor or social worker. And she said, well, I know these chaplains at the hospital that I think they were young and they were kind of cool. And she said, I'd like you to meet them. And so I met these chaplains, and then they invited me through these connections. They started inviting me to go on rounds with them in the hospital. Wow. And, so what they would do is they would go to it was kind of like having a student. They would go into a patient's room and say, hey, I got this kid out here. I got this guy who's thinking of going to seminary, maybe. And would you mind if I brought him in so he can just kind of see what a chaplain does? And this happened one after another, after another, after another. And I can still remember it. It still gives me goosebumps. I mean, I'd never done anything like that before. And so to be invited into these hospital rooms, whether you've been in hospital rooms, Kathy, you never know what you're going to walk into. You might be walking into someone that's at the end of life, someone's at the beginning of life. You might be walking into a major life-threatening issue. You just never know. You don't know what the faith background is, the person you're walking into. But what the common experience was these conversations were so deep and so holy and so profound because as you know, and when people are in those vulnerable places in their life, it's this time of deep awareness, deep awakening, deep conversations about faith and meaning and life and healing. And to be able to be a chaplain and facilitate those conversations and then to pray with people, I was just transformed by those experiences. And that looked to me a lot more, so that's what really drew me to ministry. Yes, I liked my rector of my church and that all looked interesting, but it was really this chaplaincy ministry that really drew me to ministry. So that combination of faith and healing from the very beginning. And so I went to seminary. Now I almost pursued chaplaincy. I actually did some advanced training in chaplaincy. I ended up instead going into mental health in what we call pastoral counseling. So I got an advanced degree in counseling and marriage and family therapy. And so I brought the faith and the healing together in a counseling ministry, which has been my ministry most of my life, most of my ministry. But that, it's so deeply connected to the ministry of Jesus. I mean, it's hard to turn a page in the gospel and not read a story of Jesus healing and being involved in some kind of healing. So I know you shared, not that everybody had a chance to look at it, but that article I wrote recently about, I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and there's this area in the airport called the recombobulation area. And that's, the ministry of healing is being present to people when they're in some state of discombobulation, when they're in some state of vulnerability. And to be able, and again, now obviously as a rector of a parish, that's a part of your ministry. You could be in a hospital room, 2 hours from now. Well, maybe now with COVID-19, but in normal circumstances, the phone can ring and all of a sudden you're in a hospital. So healing ministry is certainly part of every priest's ministry. Those of us that choose to make it a specialty, it really becomes the major focus of our ministry. Being with those people, yeah.
So you were one of the first people I knew, back in the 80s, at least in Milwaukee, we kind of thought about parish priesthood is real priesthood.
Yes.
Anything that's not in a parish is non-parochial was the word we used. And and you might have a therapist, but the church was different. So you were one of the first people I knew who really took that holistic approach. And it's really that's really played out in your vocation.
My entire vocation. Yeah. Exactly. People used to ask me, the light of what you're saying, people used to ask me, where's your altar, Scott? Where's your altar? And then you remember that book that Barbara Brown Taylor wrote about 10 years ago called An Altar in the World?
Altar in the World, yeah. I
used to say that. I said my altar's wherever I'm meeting with people. That's where the sacrament of taking place.
It needs to be made clear that in the Diocese of Milwaukee, it was a very much, at least when we were there, a high church, very priest-oriented. We didn't really do much of this nonsense with lay ministry, none of that. And so that's one of the things I remember about you is really bringing those two things together, kind of against the tide a little bit.
It was against the tide. And it's probably still a little bit that way, to be honest with you. But it's to me, remember that the word psyche in Greek means soul. So the word psychology is literally the study of the soul. Right. And up until Freud came along, there was no understanding ever in the history of human consciousness that healing and mental health could be separated from spiritual health. And so this is really an ancient approach to, it's a holistic approach to integrating what was always integrated for Jesus.
Right.
And so it's been a great adventure and a great privilege and a great honor to be in this ministry. And certainly the church has been very affirming of it along the way.
I went to a conference one time where we were talking about acupuncture and yoga and a lot of what we call the non-traditional methods of seeking healing. And finally somebody said, these are the ancient forms of healing. This is the ancient, why are we calling this alternative medicine. This was the original way.
Exactly. And how many times does Jesus end a healing story with the words, "Go in peace, your faith has made you well"? The way wellness is not some new age concept. It's something we've been talking about for 2,000 years in the church.
So then if you fast forward a little bit, I'd like to know a little bit about the Living Compass, about how that idea came to you. I don't remember how long it's been since you founded that, and how things really came together. There was a lot of synchronicity in the way that ministry came together.
So Living Compass started in 2010, but what it grew out of before that. So I did the full-time counseling work for probably 20 years, very full-time. And as much as I love that work, and I still do some of it, the only thing that I was longing for was, or say it this way, the only thing I would regret about that work is that people would often wait until they were in an absolute crisis, to have the conversation that they needed to have. And so that was one thing. The other thing I realized, there would be days where I would see 6 or 7 people from the same church dealing with similar issues around parenting, or around grief, or just around midlife. And they were all talking to me, but none of them were talking to each other. So all these things were working on me, and I kept thinking, what would it be like to move these conversations more upstream and create ministries of healing and wholeness and wellness that are congregational based, as opposed to kind of almost in the private practice model base. Now, there's a time and place for that one-on-one visits, absolutely. But what if we could have these conversations more in terms of our communities? So I interviewed with a church in Milwaukee, was actually looking for a new rector at that time, St. Christopher's. And I took a call there, and together, because they had this vision, if you'll remember that church, it has 5 acres of land, and it's almost like a retreat center. And so we developed all these wellness programs for the community, and found out that there really was a need in a ministry for the church to be able to involve in these kind of wellness offerings. So it was out of that experience of parish ministry and wellness and wholeness that Living Compass was birthed. And that there was some synchronicity with a family in Milwaukee that believed in this vision too, the Nicholas family, that were very generous in funding this ministry. And so what we've been doing with Living Compass is we create wellness materials, and then we train people. We were very fortunate to have you come and join us for a training in Chicago last fall. And we train people to use these resources and bring them to life in their own congregations, to be these centers of wholeness and healing and wellness in their local context. And so, the Living Compass is the 4 points are heart, soul, strength, and mind. It's all grounded in a deep theological foundation. But it's really about equipping churches to be engaged more intentionally. And every church is doing ministries of healing and wholeness. It's just those that want to be more intentional and expand those ministries. So that's what we do. And I love it because I get to work with the whole church, and I get to work with people from all over the country. And as I said when we were starting out, we have people. We have these wonderful Anglican Church of Ireland people that are using our programs over in Ireland. So that's been a lot of fun too. But because ministries of healing, and they also cross over to all different denominations too. So we're really about equipping churches to be those centers of healing in their own context.
And then you've taken some of those resources and made them appropriate for secular settings as well.
Yes.
So
we have, yes.
So people come to you. You have a retreat center, basically, or at the Nicholas Center in the Diocese of Chicago. People come to you, but then you also go out to other places. Yeah,
we do. Yeah. We do. We might even, come to Williamsburg someday if we
That'd be
have an
awesome.
invitation. So
I'm in. I'm in.
Okay. We love to go to Williamsburg for lots of reasons, but yeah, exactly. Well, and the way the secular emerged is people would come to these trainings and say, okay, I'm a teacher, I'm a social worker. I want to use these materials in my school and my nonprofit, but I need to take some of the explicit faith language out. And so we thought long and hard about that, but then we thought, well, this is what, Jesus didn't limit his healing to people that were inside the synagogue. Jesus was going out into the streets and bringing his healing to everyone. And so in some ways, I would say our ministry is like the YMCA. Our DNA is Christian, but we serve everyone. Or think of hospital. You think of a hospital that is started by a Christian order or a Christian denomination. It serves everyone. And so we have resources that serve schools and nonprofits and boys and girls clubs, and yes, exactly. So because you know, Carl Jung said a long time ago, named or not named, God is present. I mean, God is the source of all healing, you know, whether that's explicitly named or not named in my theology. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, so as a priest and a therapist, and you used the word vulnerability earlier, right now we are in a time of great vulnerability, a time of really a lot of trauma. You've got societal trauma, and it's traumatic for us as individuals to be isolated. Can you talk about the vulnerability and trauma kind of from the spiritual and the psychological? What are you seeing in your practices, in your practice? Talk about that a little bit.
Sure, absolutely. You know, a fellow Episcopalian of ours, Brene Brown, has led the way on talking to us about vulnerability, and we actually draw on a lot of her work as well. And I mean, the short answer to dealing with trauma and vulnerability, the absolute most important thing, and this comes into, it's the whole basis for our Living Compass ministry, is the most important way of dealing with vulnerability and trauma is to be able to stay connected and to be able to talk about it. And so the opposite of what we often do, especially those of us who are men, but I think any of us can do it. I certainly was raised and socialized when I'm feeling vulnerable to isolate and to shut down and to pull away. And that's the last time, that's the last time I want to actually talk and be connected to people. So it's counterintuitive to us. And maybe as Episcopalians too, it's harder for us to be open and honest about our vulnerability. But it is, we have a saying, and it's not just a Living Compass, it's really a core mental health principle. You know, when it comes to vulnerability and trauma, we have two choices. We can either talk it out or we can act it out. If we don't talk it out, we will act it out, or it will come out in inappropriate ways. It will come out in physical symptoms. It will come up in relational symptoms. It'll come up in our spiritual lives. It'll come up in all kinds of other ways. And so it's as simple as that and as hard as that. We need to be able to talk about it. So again, everything we're doing in our ministry is to help equip congregations to make space, to hold these conversations. I mean, that's really all I don't have the power to heal anyone. The only person that has the power to heal someone is God. When I'm a therapist, I'm a midwife. I'm a midwife to God's healing process. All I can do is create space for that person to show up and be heard and be seen and be able to talk and speak their truth and speak their vulnerability. And it's in that space that the healing happens with God. Well, the same is true in our ministries. The same is true with us now. So I actually think there's an opportunity here with this pandemic, because we have such a collective sense of vulnerability, and so we obviously we're all affected by it differently, but there's a collective sense in which we're all experiencing loss. We're all experiencing some disruption, some discombobulation in our lives. But as people of faith, you know, I have a graphic. I don't know if it'd be helpful to show that graphic now, or I can.
Let's come back to it. I know
sure.
it. Yeah.
But we need to first of all, we just need to make space for it. I mean, I know, like when you do pastoral care, right? When you're like we're talking about a hospital setting, if you come face to face with trauma, the most important thing you can do is just be present. Is just show up and be present and give witness to it and let people be and not try to do an end run around it, not try to solve it prematurely, not try to just to create a space for it, to hold it. It's what we do in liturgy. It's what we do in liturgy. You create a space when we do a liturgy. We create a space for people to bring their sorrow, if it's a funeral or we just hold space for it. And I think we know how to do that. And that's
right. So Brene Brown says you can either isolate and numb yourself, or you can go right into it, right? You can go through the vulnerability into it. And one of the things I love about what she says is that when you go into it, when you face vulnerability and stay connected either to yourself or to others, or both, that then what you're doing is you're choosing your own story. You're not letting, you said it'll act out one way or the other. And so If you go into it, then you're choosing the ending to your story yourself.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that. To go into it more deeply, that's the paradox.
Right.
That's what Jesus did, right? I mean, Jesus modeled that for us. And who amongst us can't look back at those times in our lives when we've experienced the greatest vulnerability is often the time we've experienced the deepening of our spiritual lives.
Right.
But again, we have to choose. I like that. I like what you said. We have to actively choose to go into it instead of try to, defend against it or run from it.
Right.
Absolutely.
Another thing I like that she says is that, and I'd like to throw it back to you in terms of not only the health pandemic, but the historic pandemic of racial injustice that we have right now in this mess together. But
right.
Another thing that Brene says is people have to earn the right to hear your story.
Say it again. People have to
earn the right.
Yes.
To hear your story. So
Yes.
Back to your work in congregations or with other groups, you're building trust,
yes,
building vulnerability, encouraging people to stay connected, right?
Yeah.
And then,
Yes.
so why don't you, if you wouldn't mind, this might be a good time for your curve, but I'm wondering about the twin pandemics that we're in right now, the trauma and vulnerability.
Great. I actually think there's a connection, and I'll talk about that here. So I'm going to pull this graphic up here, and this graphic is called the J curve, and because it looks like the letter J, it's not a Nike swoosh. It is it is called the J curve. It actually comes out of you can see the name down here. It actually comes out of political science background. But the J curve is really it's a very simple thing to understand, but it has a profound teaching wisdom for us as we navigate something like the vulnerability of a pandemic. And I would also say, as we navigate these conversations around these racial conversations that we're having. Let me just teach the concept real quickly. The two axes of the J curve are stability and resilience and growth. Or in the language of that article I wrote, this is the discombobulation axis. And what it shows is that anytime we go through any kind of a disruption, any kind of a profound change, the bigger the change, the deeper the J curve. The more unexpected the change, the deeper the J curve. The more unplanned the change, the deeper the J curve will be. And so what it shows us is that when we first experience this vulnerability, our stability is declining, right? Now, you can think of all kinds of applications in your own life because we're in J curves all the time. A J curve can be something very silly and simple. It can be, the J curve can be, you had to upgrade the operating system on your phone or on your computer. And now you're having to learn a new way of navigating your phone. A J curve can be something you choose. A retirement is a J curve. Choosing to have a child, a new job, a move, going back to school. Those are all J curves. Initially, they're destabilizing, but obviously we think of J curves as losses. So like a pandemic is a huge loss. When a person has a health crisis, when a person loses their job, when a person has a financial loss, obviously we're going down the J curve here, right? And so the initial path of this plunge of instability, the most normal human reaction, the most typical human reaction is that we want to go back. Right? And you and I, we just were briefly talking about this the other day, Kathy, and what was the biblical story you immediately thought of?
We want to go back to Egypt. We are out here in the wilderness, so-called promised land.
Thank you.
At least in Egypt, we had leeks to eat.
Exactly. It was familiar.
None of this damn manna.
None of this damn manna, exactly. I want to go back. Because literally, you read in the book of Exodus, the people come to Moses and they say, we don't like this. This is too unstable. It's too unfamiliar. It's too uncomfortable. We want to go back. That is a natural human reaction. I'm sure we've never heard that in any of our congregations before, right?
Right.
Why can't we go back to the way it used to be? It used to be, we used to have this, we used to have that. Why can't we go back? I wish we could go back to the way it used to be. And that's, again, we have to acknowledge that. Who doesn't want to go back to being able to go to restaurants and go back to church and go to concerts? And of course I want to go back. Of course we want to go back, especially when something has been taken away from us without our permission and without our consent. We've had a loss, of course. And so that's a natural stage of that. It's not, I'm not shaming it, I'm not judging it, but we have to be careful that we don't get stuck there. because this is the spiritual wisdom now of the J curve. The way we navigate the J curve, the way we move forward, this is what you were talking before. How do we get through trauma? How do we navigate these difficult conversations? Because the conversations around race are having the exact same response. There's people that want to go back. Why, do we really need to be having these conversations? Can't we just kind of go back to when it was we were being maybe a little more polite about these conversations? They weren't so as disruptive. They weren't so as uncomfortable. These conversations are making me really uncomfortable. There's a part of me that really doesn't want to have them. Thank you very much. I would like to go back, but we can't go back. God is not a God of going back. Jesus is not a Jesus of going back. He's always going forward. And the going forward, the gospel for this Sunday, I don't know if you're preaching this Sunday or not.
I am.
Okay.
Would you like to preach for me?
I actually am preaching here in Milwaukee. But just for those who haven't read the gospel, Jesus says, don't think that I came to bring a peace. Don't think that I came to bring peace. I came to bring a sword. And it's the part of Jesus that is the disruptor. So that disruption, though, but with Jesus, so the way to navigate the J curve is to let go, is to step into our story of vulnerability, to accept that we can't go back, but to trust that we are not alone. Though I walk through the valley of a J curve, I will fear no evil because you are with me. And that is exactly the promise. This is the Jesus curve. Jesus does not promise us that we will not have J curves. He promises us that he will walk through us with every J curve. And think about the ministry of the church too. Think your church does this all the time. You're walking with people through J curves all the time, through your ministries, whether both ministries to people within your congregation, to people that are in your community. All outreach communities. If you're working think about people going through recovery from addiction. Talk about a J curve. People that are going to trying to leave domestic violence. Talk about J curve. God is always calling us through J curves, because the J curves are how we go. This is the death and resurrection. Sometimes we have to let go of what we have had in order to make room for the new life that Jesus has in mind for us. It's never easy. It's always vulnerable. But we need two things to navigate the J curve. We need God and we need community. And so that's why this concept is so important. And I think the J curve applies both to the pandemic as well as to what's going on in the racial. I even wonder, and I really, this is just a wonder, and I haven't even said this out loud. I think I said it out loud to my wife yesterday. I even wonder if we were talking about the collective vulnerability of the pandemic. I actually wonder if that not that God causes this pandemic for this to happen. I don't believe that. But out of that collective vulnerability, I wonder if that's why we're more open to having these harder conversations about race. There may be the soil, the parable of the soil may be already have turned up a little bit, turned over less. It's not as hard as it used to be. And so maybe the seeds of these long overdue conversations can happen. But
so where on the, excuse me, I'm sorry.
No,
where along the curve does it stop being a crisis and start being, is that like when it starts going up? Like in the 12-step community, they talk about, you got to hit bottom. So is that the bottom?
Yes, I think that's part of it. I do think we have some choice on how, just as the person who's struggling in addiction, we have some choice on how long we want to hold on. I think we actually can flatten the J curve by earlier on acknowledging that, giving up our desire to go back. The paradox is that the more we try to go back, we may actually stall and deepen the decline, which is the paradox. So this is getting maybe too nuanced, but I think we have some choice in how deep the J curve will go. I think I've always struck by that line in Psalm 23, that though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. And what I mean by what strikes me about that is the one thing that we don't have to feel as Christians is fear. We don't have to be afraid. We don't need to be afraid of death. There cannot be resurrection without death. Now we will feel grief, we will feel anger, we will feel loss, but I think it can stop being, I think it can stop being scary the moment we accept, we make peace that this is what's happening, and we stop fighting it, and we let go and let God. This is the letting go. This is the letting God. And I think, but we can't get to the letting God until we do the letting go. So I think we have some say over that. But and obviously the J curve can be, deeper, it can be flat, it can be prolonged, but.
So what happens as you get up? Like, so you're in the valley of the shadow, you've bottomed out, you've let go, and you said let God. So what's on the upswing?
Well, I think what's on the upswing is change, and that's also hard too, right? So to use the racial conversations that are happening, there's a growing consensus that certain things need to die, that certain practices, certain ways of policing, certain
systems,
laws, certain systems have to. Okay, so we can agree. There's an agreement about what cannot, innocent, black men cannot continue to be killed by police. Okay, that's pretty easy to agree on that. Now, when we start to do the letting God, and what is the new change? What is the new? It's like in the church, right? We may agree that the church as we know it has to change, but the church that's being born is, of course, we're going to have some spirited conversations about that. So this is the work of building. This is the work of building the new, which is also obviously challenging too. But this is resurrection work. This is life-giving work. And we can't get to this until we're willing to let go of this. Okay, and so this is a willingness to be changed. This is a willingness to this is a willingness to live into the new life that God has in store for us, and that also requires a certain vulnerability too. But this is
I like that resilience and growth kind of go together, and that's one of Brené's things is that when you practice the vulnerability, you become more resilient and you grow, and then you practice the vulnerability and you become more resilient, and that takes courage, and then you grow. And so it's this constant cycle of being brave, being courageous, and become. That's the way you become resilient.
Exactly.
So, Scott, Alice has asked, are you saying that the pandemic has been an equalizer which allows for common discussion? You referred to that a little bit about the time maybe making us more vulnerable and easier.
Right. Let me think about that. It could be. I hadn't quite thought in terms of that, an equalizer. I think perhaps it has. Perhaps it has. I just know that here's an analogy I would use, and I'm sure you've had this experience, Kathy, as a priest. When let's say a person gets a very scary health diagnosis, and maybe they're later in life, and that creates an incredible vulnerability for them. And in and out of that vulnerability, all of a sudden now they're having conversations with some loved ones that maybe they were estranged from, or maybe they were in conflict with, conversations that might not have happened if there hadn't been the cancer, or there hadn't been not that God brings the cancer just so you can have the conversation, but that's more the way I was thinking of it, that I think sometimes when God breaks open our shell, our normal ways of being, where there's a possibility for conversations that maybe wouldn't have happened otherwise. So yeah, I think it's somewhat like that, what you're saying.
I don't know if equalizer is the word. I don't think it's quite the right word. I think what you're talking about is when something is stripped away, then one of the things that I've thought a lot about is the things that have been taken away from us with regard to church, many or being together. Many of those things are things we didn't need anyway. So what you're talking about is barriers are stripped away.
Yes.
Equalizer is not quite the right word, but
and Alice has put up another comment that I totally agree with, and I apologize for not speaking that. I was thinking that absolutely the pandemic has pulled back the curtain of inequality. There's no denying that this pandemic is literally killing and affecting people of color and people that that are in very unequal situations, it's affecting them very differently. That's why we can't say that we're all in this together, because we're not all in this together. It absolutely has shined a light on those disparities.
But the way through is in the power of relationship, and that's what makes the health pandemic tricky, is that for everything requires relationship. The healing of all kinds takes relationship. We don't do any of it in isolation. And so, right. Yeah.
But it's also revealed to us. It does make it tricky, yes, because we can't be together literally. But it also heals. It is also revealed to us how what's the word? Just how completely our choices affect one another. How interconnected we truly are.
Right.
And both in terms of the spreading of the virus, but also in now protecting one another from the. I mean, we are so interconnected, which is also the same thing we're raising consciousness with around the racial issues too.
Right.
So yeah.
Then speaking of back to especially the racial justice conversation, one of the things I've seen in your work at Living Compass is the wheel, if I'm remembering right, a change flow chart of change or something, and it's a spiral. I bet you can show that to us. Or I mean,
yeah,
the process is a spiral.
Yeah, it's I have it in a couple of different formats here. Where did that one go now? Is it in oh, it's in here. Okay, hold on here. This is work one. Okay, so this is not original to our work. This is and I'm sure there's people on the call here that are on the webinar that have seen this in some capacity. It's called the stages of change theory. And here it's not so much a spiral, but a linear way, but it's the same stages. This is based on the work of two psychologists named Prochaska and Di Clemente that help us to understand that when that change must go through, is what they would say, these stages. And it's helpful when especially when we're having conversations like around race, but it's really, if you're leading any change, if you're leading change in a congregation, if you're leading change in your workplace, if you're leading change in your family, that the stages of change are pretty predictable. And once we understand them, it gives us a nuanced way to understand, especially like, for example, the conversations around race right now, that often people are in different stages of change. So pre-contemplation, it's a little light there if you can read that. Pre-contemplation means we're literally not even thinking about a change. We're pre-thinking about it. Now we could be in pre-contemplation because we're in denial. So, we don't want to think about racial disparities, or certainly in the field of addiction, a person doesn't want to think that they might have a problem with drugs or alcohol, or I don't want to think about, what some issue in my life or we just could be in pre-contemplation because we don't really know about something, or we don't, So pre-contemplation is we're not in a stage of change yet. The first stage of change is that we begin to think about it. We have some thought about a change. So again, this works for very profound things like racism, but it also works for very simple things. So just today, you may have heard somebody mention a book or mention a movie that they saw. It's the first time you heard of that movie. It's the first time you heard of that book. And you think, I heard I have a thought. I'm contemplating. I wonder, maybe I'd like to read that book. Maybe I'd like to see that movie. You haven't made the change yet. You haven't bought the book. You haven't read the book. You haven't seen the movie, but you're thinking about it. So maybe somebody's raising for the first time. Maybe for the first time you're hearing this phrase about white privilege or white fragility. Maybe you've been talking about this for 20 years, but maybe you just heard about it. Maybe someone else has just heard about it for the first time today. So it's a brand new idea for them. It's a brand new concept. So contemplation does not lead to change in and of itself. If we continue through the stages of change, we go to what we call preparation. So preparation usually means that we get more information. We begin to have conversations with other people about something. We want to learn about it. So maybe I want to talk to a few other people, see if they've read this book that I've heard about or gone to this movie. Or there's going to be a workshop coming up on racism or on whatever, on something else. And maybe I'm thinking of going. I'm going to call. I'm going to find out about it. I'm going to start preparing for the change. I'm going to think about making that change. And then, you know, again, I use retirement as before. I'm thinking about retirement. I'm going to begin to plan for my retirement. I'm actually going to do it. So it might take years to go through the stages of change. It might take a couple of minutes to go through the stages of change. Somebody might tell you about a new app today. You look up the app in the App Store, you download the app, and now you're using the app. You just went through the stages of change. They can take a long time, or they can take a short time. Then once we prepare for that change, then we may take the step. We may actually have the conversation. So this day you're thinking about, you want to talk to someone about a conversation. I actually did this week. I have a friend who's African American. I've been friends with her and her husband for a long time. I've never asked her the question that I wanted to ask her this week. And I had a thought about it, and then I began to kind of prepare myself for it. So I asked her this week, I said, I've been reading about the conversation that every parent has to have as African American with their kids about how they have to act when they go out in the world. Did you have that conversation with your 4 kids? And we had an hour-and-a-half conversation about what that conversation, what it's like as a parent to have that conversation. Or as she said, it's not a conversation you have, it's a conversation you have each and every day, each and every time they leave the house. So I had to go through the stages of change to have that conversation. So action is the stage that we get through that. And then once we've been doing something, once we've been, their understanding of maintenance is we've been doing something for 6 months. So most of us, for example, are in, this is a great little model to think about when you think about trying to reach out to a newcomer coming to church. Most of us are in maintenance about going to church and being part of a faith community. There's plenty of people out there that are in pre-contemplation. There's some people that are in contemplation about thinking about maybe coming to a church. They might want to come to St. Martin's. They've been thinking, you know, maybe they came for a funeral. Maybe they're thinking about coming. Maybe they go to the website, see if when you're going to have services again, if you have an online services, maybe they're thinking, you know, and then they finally come. Once they come and join, and they become in dinner and maintenance. So in terms of the racial conversations, as a culture, we're in every one of these stages. And that's often where the conflict emerges, is because we have, and again, without judgment, we just have people, any of us can be in any one of these stages. People are in pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. And so it's a helpful way to think about that. And what I remember saying at the training, Kathy, and I think you resonated with this, when we're in leadership, again, whether it's in a congregation or whether it's in any context, the biggest mistake we can make as leaders is if we're down here at action and maintenance, all of a sudden we want to bring everybody, you know, to where we are. And it just doesn't work that way. If you try to move people through these stages of change too fast, they will often resist and rebel against it. So it's just a helpful way to me to think of how change happens, but also when we're in that J curve, right? It's some way of thinking about we're all in different stages. You know, some people are ready and excited to go forward and move on the other side and start building the new normal, whatever that new normal is going to be. Other people might take years to let go of the old normal.
So I want to point out a question that we have here. But then you have, I see over, but first I want to let you finish this. I see that if you leave, what are these arrows off to the right that lead to relapse?
It shows us that I like to think of it as a teeter-totter, that we often go back and forth. We move forward,
oh, I see.
And then we move back. We move forward, and then we move back. And then so it's not just boom, 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 right? Okay, and this is what people that have worked a lot longer than I have and are a lot more on the front lines of racial justice say, you know, we move forward, we have conversations when there's a shooting, when there's a tragedy, and then we go back as if, you know, and nothing changes.
Right.
And then there's a crisis, and then we have a conversation and we move forward, we get some action, but then we go back. And so, again, think of this, it's easy to think of this like in terms of recovery, or if you ever tried to lose 20 pounds, okay? It's not a linear process. You go forward, you go back, you go forward. So it's just to normalize that's okay. That's you know, that's the human condition. We go forward, we go back, we go forward, we go back. We really need to change the way we do things as a church, but I really don't want to change it. I kind of like it the way, but we really do need to change it, but I'm not sure I want to change it. So yeah, that's what those are.
So I don't know if you've seen this question from Melanie Davis, that she says, I'll read it for the benefit of the other folks. This is a very helpful diagram for the continuum that we've been discussing. How best can we provide ways for people to engage at their own pace so that people that are just beginning to acknowledge racial issues exist can engage from that point, while those that have been committed to racial change for decades can move more immediately into action? So you got this process, but we have a community engaging in the process at various stages and together.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you make room for all the places on the continuum and all the people in their own place? How do we do that?
Well, I mean, again, I don't have some kind of magic answer to that. I think there's a lot of wisdom we all can bring to that. I know one way I do that is I always, again, whether it's around race or whether it's around LGBTQ issues or it's around literature reform or whatever. I mean, I have to remember that I once was, if I'm quote more along those stages of change on an issue, I have to remember that once was a time when I wasn't. And so I think I need to find a way to really celebrate and affirm that first step that a person makes, even though it may be a baby step to me, it may feel like a very small step. I need to honor that and celebrate that. But we don't need to define ourselves by the lowest common denominator. We don't need to. But I think, I mean, to me, it's no different. I mean, this is, to me, was frankly one of the challenges of being a rector, right? I mean, just in terms of the spiritual life in general, on every given Sunday, you have people that are there for the very first time and people that have been there for 40 years. You have people that have been walking a deep spiritual path their entire lives, and you have people that are just considering this for the first time. So I think I don't have a specific answer to that. I think we always need to have. I guess the one thing I think I said is that I think sometimes in the church we cater to the lowest common denominator, meaning. So I think we need to have some advanced and bold. And again, it's going to be different in each congregation, right? So it sounds like, you know, in fact, this question is even being asked tells me that your congregation is probably in a different place in a lot of congregations, that you're already having these conversations.
You know, I'm thinking about the image of the body of Christ, and how each part of the body, no part of the body can say to another part that they don't need it. I'll tell you, I was well into my 50s before I really made the connection with the body of Christ is us. I mean, you know, we say these words, but in fact, we are the parts of the body of Christ, and we can't not need each other.
Yes, and we can't. And I saw a wonderful post the other day on Facebook in a group that says, let's not judge one another. You know, let's not have one standard of what everybody needs to do to be involved in supporting this movement. We all, that's what made me think, we all have our part. And so I think that's right. I mean, there was a huge protest here in my town organized by a lot of my colleagues in the African American churches. And I so wanted to go, but I just don't feel comfortable. I got some health issues, and I did not feel safe going because of COVID-19, and it broke my heart to not be able to go and support them. So, but they were very gracious and very understanding. But I think we all got to find our own voice. But I think we want to keep moving people forward, and we as a church. I mean, I think that's really what we're thinking about. I mean, there's individuals, but we as a church have certainly circled around this issue for far too long.
David Benedict wants to know how the vestry can help open the door to the process of change. How can the vestry as the elected leadership in a parish model and lead the way on systemic change?
I'm sure you do this, Kathy. I know I do. I mean, one of the ways that I'm going to do it in my sermon on Sunday. One of the ways that I think we can lead people in change and model change is to simply tell our own stories. Okay, so I'm going to tell some of my own story of my own awakening around racial issues and racial justice issues, and again, there's a vulnerability in that, right? And I actually cringe at some of my story and some of the things that I experienced. I grew up in in a congregation in the suburb of Milwaukee that used to hold meetings of the John Birch Society. I grew up in a racist church, a racist Episcopal church. And so I grew up in a racist family. So I think the power of story, of telling our own story and our own journey, I think can be can build community, can build consensus, can invite other people to tell their story. Again, Brene Brown comes to mind. We have to be willing to be awkward and to be willing to rumble in the conversations. And if we wait until they're easy, they'll never happen. The conversation I had with my friend this week was very awkward at first, and then it was very beautiful. And it was, so I think we're back to that same thing. We have to be able to make space for this kind of vulnerability and awkwardness, and allow ourselves to be disrupted.
Right. Melanie again says, we don't want those on either end of the continuum to feel judged and to be found lacking. That's a good phrase, to be found lacking. We're supporting one another wherever we are in the shared journey. And that's the spiritual concept that we are one body, right? And not only we who are alive, but the communion of saints is one of the most powerful images that we have. Those who've gone before, those whom we love but see no longer, we say in the funeral service, and the saints that are yet to come.
And you opened our time together tonight with remembering one of those saints.
Right.
And
right.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dean asks, should we be familiar with the issues? Oops, I lost it. Should we be familiar with the issues that the other side has as we move toward a solution? So I guess he's asking about how can we have compassion? And this is a conversation we started at St. Martin's a couple of years ago. How do you have compassion for people who are on different sides of an issue?
Right.
Who is the other?
Right.
I don't know. That's a pretty big question, and it's a hard question to answer
right.
in one way.
I don't know if you used, or I remember going to a training 20 years ago. I think maybe this was when I was a rector, and at that point it was, how do we host more meaningful conversations around the LGBTQ issues? And I remember this transformative question that I used over and over and over again, and it really opened things up for people, was rather than coming together and say, okay, let's have small group conversations and tell people where you stand on this issue. The question was this: take some time and tell your story about how you came to form your opinion on this issue. Tell a story of how your earliest experiences around this issue, because it begins to humanize it then, and it begins to soften the, again, this is radical Jesus stuff, but I would love to get together. I would love to get it together with and so would Jesus, not just with the victims of racial violence, but I'd like to sit down with a white supremacist and say, how did you form how did you get formed? Because Jesus wants to heal the white supremacists as much as he wants to heal the victims of violence. Mm-hmm. And we all, and that's the thing, that's the to me, one of the parts of our racism is what is doing to destroy the racists. It's not just what is to destroying them. And so how do we examine the way, and this is why I love being a family therapist, because how did you form your opinions about this? How did you form, what were the things that, and because once you can bring them into consciousness, then you can let them go, and then you can heal them, and you can name them biases. So
right.
That's a lot.
Well, I'm wondering, as a mental health professional, and this is probably, I'm aware that we're getting to the top of the hour, so this will probably wrap us up. But Blanche asks, if relationships are central, what can we do to facilitate relationship between different groups? So in your work as a therapist, presumably you're a marriage and family counselor,
Right.
right? So you presumably had to help build a bridge between people who were basically in different camps. So,
Right.
you know, what's your approach to that?
Right. Wow, that's a big question. Again is one of the most important principles we teach, for example, in marriage communication, is to use what we call I statements. And so I statements is that this is what I believe, this is what I experience, this is the lens through which I am viewing this is my truth, and that we agree at a ground rule that we will honor that. It's like if I say, if I'm sitting, you and I are sitting in the same room and I say, I feel hot, you can't say, well, no, you don't. I don't feel hot. Well, you can't honor that. You can't dishonor that. So as opposed to you statements are almost always conflict producing. They create defensiveness. This is what I believe. This is what I long for. This is what I experience. And this is what we're making room for now, is to simply allow, and this is what I'm very aware of as a white privileged male, I gotta get out of the way. This is not my time to be talking. This is my time to listen and let them use their I statements. This is what I experience. This is my truth. This is what I have experienced. This is what I do experience. This is what I long for. So it's a radical listening and honoring each person's individual that I experience. I think that's always a starting point.
I find the idea of making space and holding space, I find that a very compelling idea, because it implies a kind of pushing out on, like, okay, it's not your turn to talk right now. We're going to hold the space for somebody else to talk. I think making space is a very powerful community value. It's a value, yeah.
And to be more conscious of the space that we're holding, and I think that's the life. That's really so much the work of a congregation, and
because
it's our work as individuals too.
Right. Because if you're talking or yelling or saying you're not doing that. You're not making space. Right. And there's a physical.
One other thought about that. I remember being a consultant then when I was a rector, and the consultant challenged us with this question, and it really disturbed me. I really got upset when she asked it, because it touched on the truth. Her question was, who's not welcome in this church? Who would walk in here on a Sunday morning and not feel welcome? And I, of course, said, everybody's welcome here. She said, that's not what I asked. She goes, who would walk in here on Sunday morning and not feel welcome? And it's like, oh, wow, that was a whole different question. And so that raised a consciousness for us so I think, yeah, how we hold space is always evolving. And it's always deepening as Jesus continues to challenge us and deepen us. Yeah.
Right.
It's as simple as that and as hard as that.
Yeah.
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 And like this conversation tonight, it's not tidy. There's no nice bow we can put around this. There's no nice, easy conclusion. It's onward. And I'm just grateful for all of you to be part of this conversation. I'm grateful for my friendship with you, Kathy, to have this conversation. It went in the way that exactly I needed it to go. It's always a little messy and it's not precise. And we got to keep moving these conversations forward one at a time.
Right, and I really hear your reminder, your encouragement to listen.
Absolutely.
I think right now, especially for white people, listening. It's more about listening than talking. Yeah.
We teach about listening to understand as opposed to listening to respond.
Right.
And again, I'll speak of that's a white male privilege thing. I was raised to listen to respond, listen so I can give my expert wisdom, give my voice, give my vibe. And that is a learning curve for me, to listen to understand as opposed to listen to respond.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Thank you.
Oh my goodness, thank you. I wonder if you'd be willing to close us with a prayer. And
I would. There's a wonderful prayer that some of us may all be familiar with, or not. It may be brand new to us. But it's from the Compline service in our Book of Common Prayer, and because it deals with, I chose this prayer because we've been talking a lot about change, and just a reminder that in the midst of all the changes, there is the one who is changeless. And so here's the prayer: Be present, O merciful God, and protect us through the hours of this night, so that we who are sometimes wearied by the changes and the chances of this life may find our rest in your eternal changelessness. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Scott. Thank you all for being here and for your participation in the conversation. This was the most participation that we've had. It's a very sort of passive way of doing a conversation, so I'm really grateful that people weighed in. So,
absolutely.
Bless
Absolutely.
you, Scott. Love to Holly.
And,
thank you.
Thanks for being here, everyone. God bless. Bye-bye.